All right, everyone. I will get started. I know that folks are joining us, but as my colleague Jeff mentions, we are so excited to share some of our findings with you today around housing narrative. And so I will start by introducing myself. My name is Marisol Bello, and I'm the Communications Director for Community Change. And Community Change, along with Race Forward and Policy Link, engaged on a several months process on researching how we tell the best stories around housing to get folks engaged with us and talking about housing as an issue of public good. And so today we are sharing the findings of this amazing research that Lake Research engaged with us on. And so I am going to turn this over to my colleagues, Jeff Chang at Race Forward and Jeff Parcher, the Director of Public Affairs for Community Change, to talk a little bit more about the project and where we are going with it. And then Jeff will give us a little bit of Jeff Chang will give us a little review of the agenda before we really turn it over to Celinda Lake with Lake Partners, who will really give us the top lines for the research. And then all of you should be on mute. And if you are not, please mute yourself now, and then we'll go from there. Jeff Chang, why don't you start us off with a land acknowledgement first? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marisol. My name is Jeff Chang. I'm the I'm the Vice President of Narrative Arts and Culture at Race Forward. I've been honored and blessed to be able to work with such an amazing crew from Community Change and from Policy Link, and also with Celinda Lake and Associates over the last few months on this particular project. I'm super excited to be able to be here. One of the things that we wanted to do, really, to be able to begin this particular webinar, was to start with a land acknowledgement, because so much, of course, of the work that we do goes directly to the question of land, of home, and of shelter. And so we really must acknowledge that we gather today wherever we are, on stolen land, on stolen occupied land of Native people. So I'll start by saying aloha kako. My name is Jeff Chang, and I originally come from the Ahupua'a of Mauna Lua, Oahu, in the forcibly colonized lands of Hawaii. I recognize that the space that I live in now, that I'm here in digital space with you, that I'm coming to you from, is called Berkeley, California now, but it's on land that was taken from the Muwekma Ohlone people, who first settled this place and have stewarded the land through the generations. So I wanna pay my respect to their elders, past and present. And in spite of federal, state, and local policies, the Ohlone people continue to thrive here in their ancestral lands. However, it's important that we acknowledge that our vision of racial justice is incomplete without the return of all unceded and ceded lands to the Muwekma Ohlone people here, to the Native Hawaiians in Hawaii, to all Native peoples across the continent and around the world. And we participate in this land acknowledgement in order to ground our work in the truth, in the deep history, and the very real present of theft, of displacement, and of genocide that we still work now to undo in our myriad ways. So we acknowledge the ongoing colonial occupation of Native lands and peoples, and just as importantly, we express our gratitude to Native peoples and honor their sovereignty as they, with resilience, continue to maintain and build their nations. So we want to point you to an online tool that shows you the traditional homelands of Native peoples of the land that you may now reside upon, as well as the lands that you may call home. This is native-land.ca. So http:// native-land.ca. And I'll go ahead and put that in here into the chat. Oh, thank you, Kalima. And we want to invite all of you that are here in the chat to acknowledge the people of the land that you're on now as you join us today. Thank you for your acknowledgement, and may we move forward today so grounded for all the important work that we do. Marisol?
Apologies for that. Jeff, why don't you also kick us off on the project and talk a little bit about some of the top line findings, and then we'll turn it over to Jeff Parcher by way of introduction. Both Jeff Chang and Jeff Parcher will set a grounding for us in terms of the work that we have done over the last several months.
You know what, Marisol, I'd love to do that, and I will do that in a second, but I think we also need to recognize the historical moment that we're in right now, as well as millions around the world are in the streets and working to lift up the movement for Black lives, to defend Black lives, to stand behind the families of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor in this moment, and to recognize that the movement for racial justice has taken a new turn in the past 2 weeks, since May 25th, that actually we're in a position now where changes that were not imaginable on May 24th are happening in real time, even as we speak. And so we wanted to take just a few seconds here, a few minutes here, maybe just to think about that, to maybe take a moment of silence and honor the lives of all of those who have, especially and particularly highlighting the Black lives that have been taken too soon by state violence. So we're here today to talk about the Housing Justice Narrative Initiative. And I want to just say, first of all, that we're really grateful for Celinda Lake and her research, which provides us with a large number of messages and narratives that we can examine, as well as to understand the areas that we might want to be able to avoid in this particular instance. But to know that the work that we are doing is capable and able to be moved to the next level, particularly in this moment, that people are ready to jump in and work for housing justice, that people are very much committed to looking at race, and that in this particular moment, folks realize that race matters, and that housing justice matters. And so one of the things that we wanted to note is that this is a moment in which the race class narrative is something that we can really, really push as it applies to housing issues, that all of our top performing messages emphasize inclusion and anti-discrimination. There are caveats, and that'll be talked about today, but when we look at what's happening now, people are ready to move, and people are ready to move around racial justice in housing. What we also know is that we have a strong base with people of color, with communities of color, that Latinos are ready to organize, that African Americans consider this to be core to their central ideologies, that Asian Americans move from individualist frames to race class narrative frames as we look at the sort of expansion of these messages. And that in this moment, we recognize too that we have the ability to be able to move beyond our core constituencies towards being able to institute housing justice as one of the main movements that we can advance in this time. And I think what I'll do here is turn it back to Jeff Parcher, actually, to be able to talk about a lot more of this type of stuff and to frame up our work in a larger kind of a way. Jeff, are you there?
Jeff, you're on mute.
Jeff? Thank you, Kalima. Marisol, I can't see Jeff, and you're on mute as well.
All right, sorry about that. Let's hope that Jeff can join back here. But I will talk a little bit about, hang on one second, folks. Sorry, we're just having a slight technical difficulty, so just hang on one moment, please.
What I'll do in the meantime is I'll talk about our agenda for today. We are going to be having Celinda Lake and Jesse Klein joining us to be able to present the top line findings of this really important research. This has been one of the most thorough and far-reaching surveys of folks on housing justice in years, and we're really excited about this work. And because of that, we want to be able to spend most of the time allowing Celinda and Jesse to be able to present that work to you, and then also to be able to allow you all to ask some questions of them, which we will, in real time, via technology here, be able to bring up to Celinda and Jesse to answer. We will close out with a little bit of a call to action, let you know a little bit more about some of the other webinars that we have coming up over the course of the summer. We'll be talking about everything from diving deeper into race, looking at narrative strategy, and how we can align our messages and narratives around this work. We'll be looking at cultural strategy as well, and we'll also be talking about how this can fit in with legislative campaigns and electoral campaigns that folks are working on. So all of this is coming up over the course of the summer. We can give you the dates at that time. We hope that you'll continue to join us as we continue to roll out all of the information and to continue to work with you all to build out a real movement here, supporting narratives for housing justice.
Okay, Jeff, this is Michael Anderson, and I'm going to jump in for Jeff Parcher. We just have some audio that we can't quite get around, so we apologize. But I think in our new Zoom culture, all of us have probably seen some ups and downs in this past couple of months. In short, what I want to do on Jeff's behalf is first acknowledge the investment by Funders for Housing and Opportunity to make this research happen. I think for those of us who've been working in the housing justice field for any period of time, we know that particularly the narrative work that we need to do to center race in this discussion is ground that we have not made enough progress on. And thank you to Funders for Housing and Opportunity for sharing this priority concern that allowed our three organizations to work with Celinda Lake to move forward on this. We're also, obviously, as Jeff well acknowledged, this particular moment that we're in. But again, I think for all of us who've been in the housing justice movement, the fact that the glaring racial disparities that are part of the story of what's happening right now are something that have been all too common in the reality of housing in the United States. So we're extremely excited to turn this presentation over to Celinda and her colleague Jesse, who will then run us through the top lines of the research, and then we will open up and create some space in the chat for all of you to ask some questions. But this is just the beginning. This is the first of a 5-part webinar series. This is where we're rolling out the information, but we also are very eager with all of you to provide further tools and trainings and ways to put these valuable narrative tools into play in the field to advance our local, state, and national work. So with no further ado, we've said a couple words about Celinda Lake before, but I think if you look at some of the most progressive, cutting-edge messaging research, particularly as it ties and tries to unlock the power of organizing, you'll find Celinda Lake and her firm right in the middle of it. So we are quite honored and pleased to present to you today Celinda, who will go through this research. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And I really want to acknowledge Jess Klein and Alicia Snell, Emily Carmelli, and Megan Limott, who are the real Yo women here behind this effort. I also want to acknowledge our secret partner here, Anach Osorio, who was so involved in helping develop the initial cognitive analysis, linguistics analysis, and the initial messaging, and just an invaluable ally in this effort. And the great luxury of having such an amazing team, Community Change, Race Forward, and Policy Link, to benefit from doing all this work, and the deep immersion that we did in the beginning with many of you as activists in terms of the information and the messaging and the potential messaging. I also, Jeff, want to thank you very much for your deeply meaningful grounding in both place and in the period that we're in right now. So this is very, very exciting research. And I want to also acknowledge the funders. This was an area where there was a ton of polling already, but very little narrative work. And everybody was off on their own messages, understandably so. And the public was not moving the way that we would have hoped or that we would have believed they could, because the messages were all over the place from their point of view. And it led them to develop a very individualistic, commodity-oriented point of view that worked against many of us in terms of the policies that we wanted to see passed and the changes we want to see made. So I really commend the funders who put together the resources to do such a thorough effort. And if we look at the next slide, you can see here we began first with the cognitive analysis that Anat Shanker did, and then a deep dive in in-person focus groups all over the country. And you can see the demographics here, and all of these slides can be made available to you. That was followed with a quantitative phase, an online dial survey with extensive oversamples. And we looked at Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, Washington State, African Americans, and and people living below poverty. We call these oversamples, which is the technology in the vernacular in our field. But actually, as a firm, we believe this is appropriate sampling, that there is no speaking for America, there is no speaking for our country without including all of these voices. But it's very expensive to do this kind of research, and it was a great benefit to be part of that, and really appreciate particularly Center for Community Change for really advocating for this kind of extensive research. And then we believe very strongly that if the advocates don't believe in the message, if they won't carry the message, there is no message to be had. We often hear, and we've all been subject to this, where people have said, well, if you, the advocates have nowhere to go. Well, actually, we have lots of places to go and lots of things to do. So it was very important for us, and you'll see this in the research, to have the messaging include their voice, and it was a message that didn't include their input, that didn't respond, that they didn't respond to, was off the table as a recommendation from the beginning. So when we did this research, we have all kinds of data. If we look at the next slide, on all kinds of demographic subgroups, but what we are going to primarily focus on is a division of the electorate into three basic groups: the base, the opposition, and the persuadables. Now, these are based very much on people's fundamental attitudes about government, about housing, and fundamental value statements. We didn't determine that the base was going to be 22%. We didn't determine that all Republicans were going to be in the opposition or anything like that. We allowed the data to speak for itself and divided these three groups based on the cleavages that we saw in the data. So the base ended up being 22% of adults. They tend to be more likely to be people under 30, Democrats, and disproportionately African American and Latinx. They are not all of any of these groups, but there is a substantial base here. They have a very strong analysis of class. They believe that the wealthy achieve success because they're given more opportunities. They believe that people of color face greater barriers to economic success than white people, so they believe in racism. They believe that government should have an opportunity for in creating opportunities for advancement. And they also believe that government should have a role in housing. And you had to agree on all of these attitudes before you were in the base. The opposition is only 17% of adults. So this is not all Republicans, all older people, all white men. It is made up disproportionately of those groups, but not all of them by any matter of means. These are people that do think the wealthy achieve success because they're more emeritus, that people of color can't get ahead because they're responsible for their own condition, that government should get out of the way, and that government does not have a role in ensuring housing, and that everyone has a place to live. So you would have to wonder what you were saying to these people if they did agree with us. And in fact, we are looking for messages that isolate their voice and differentiate between our base and our opposition so that we're saying something meaningful. And when you see them dial down, if you sometimes for a second feel kind of wistfully regretful, just remember, these are not the kind of people you want to invite to your birthday party. These are not people we want agreeing with us. In fact, we want to isolate and marginalize their voice. And they only make up 17% of the public. And then finally, we have the vast majority of the electorate, 61% of adults. They have views in both opposition and base views, and they often hold them simultaneously and don't see anything mutually contradictory about them. They resemble the public overall because they are such a big group of the public, although they do lean a little younger and a little bit more likely to be lower income people. So if we turn to the next chart, if we're going to look just at the context in which we're operating, and you can see here the base and opposition very mobilized. And in fact, in general, the opposition is very energized right now. That's true across a lot of issues. The persuadables less energized. So not only do we have to focus the persuadables under our frame, but we also have to mobilize them to take action, because right now they're the least mobilized of the three groups of voters. What we're going to do today is concentrate on the key findings, and we're going to go through those and then show you the top testing messages and the architects of those messages. And by the way, this is a national, and I think Jesse may have answered this question already, but this is a national survey of all adults with the oversamples we discussed, and the error around these samples is plus or minus 3%. So let's look at the first summary. And first of all, we found lots of good news. We found that people are really ready for a national conversation on housing. There is a consensus that there is a problem here. In some other areas, we have to create the sense that there's a problem. That we don't have to do that here. People across the board think there's a problem. They think there's a national problem. They also, 2/3, think there's a problem in their own community. They name housing. They have a public orientation toward housing. They see, for the most part, a role for government here. They respond to the notion of public good, although about half the people are confused by the term public good. They think, well, it sounds okay. I mean, public is fine and good is better than bad. But a lot of people not so clear what a public good is. Our core constituency is comprised of Democrats, adults out west, African Americans, Latinx, and certain subgroups of women, including independent women and younger adults, who are really primed to take action on housing. Even though in most people's minds there has not been much of a debate nationally about housing policies, that's how they see it. They think they've heard about it more at a state and local level. They believe overwhelmingly that there is a clear role for government, including the federal government. Now, there are two things that are complicated about the role of government. One thing that's complicated is who's in charge of the federal government. So not surprisingly, Democrats tend to see most a role for government in housing, and including a national federal role. But they also are cross pressure because they think of Trump and the Republicans as being in charge of the federal government and don't trust them on any issue. Republicans, a little bit more leery about a role for government, but reassured because they see themselves as their own people in charge. So it's important here to define the role for government, but to know that we're not fighting a battle here where people can't imagine a role for government, don't see that as a role for government. And that was a very pleasant surprise. We were surprised how open people were to it. People can name a couple of policies here, but they really have a paucity of policy agenda in their head. Some people will mention rent control, a little bit of public housing, but people really not very clear what the policies would be in housing, the government policies. This is in stark contrast to the economy, in part because of work that many of you all have done. People are much, much more vocal about what the economic role would be, what economic policies are. And in fact, what's very interesting is for, I'm sorry, there's a lot of background noise where I am. I hope you can hear me okay. What's very interesting is for the swing voters, they would start with the economy first and move to housing, and we'll show you that data. For the base voters, they would start with housing first and move to the economy. But in general, we need to define the role for government. The biggest challenge that we have is that people have a basic commodity frame, which is ubiquitous, and it reinforces individualism. It leads to lower intensity around the public role and resistance, and people will default to the commodity frame, that this is something, it's a vending machine, that housing is a commodity, you put the money in, you get something out. When we talk about affordability, we are often reinforcing that commodity frame. And in fact, we don't have to emphasize affordability that much. It's very baked in. People have already come to a strong conclusion about affordability. And so we can refer to it, but we don't want to keep emphasizing it or isolating it because it tends to reinforce individualism and the frame of things as a commodity. A winning framework here emphasizes real lived experience and core values. And that's how we change the frame. That's how we move from individualism and commodity to what we would call a public good, a public entity. And the frame there that really works is basic human needs, a fundamental necessity. People agree overwhelmingly that housing is a basic human need and a fundamental necessity. And that cognitively switches the narrative from commodity, commercial, individualism, what you pay for, to something far more profound that we should invest in and that we have a right to design and decide what's going to happen. Race matters. Now, we're in this work, all of us, building very, very strongly on that commitment. We're also building very much on the race-class narrative approach. And of course, the second wave of race-class narrative work has already come out that many of you are familiar with. But naming race as well as class is very, very important in the housing issue, and improves our messaging. It makes our messaging stronger. And this was before even the most current events. We want to emphasize inclusion. We want to emphasize anti-discrimination. And some of the language that tested particularly well by ensuring all of us have an affordable place to call home. Most of us want to provide for our families, have a safe place to call home, and pursue our dreams regardless of what we look like or where we come from. And everyone should be able to choose where to live when you can afford it. Being denied where to live because of race, family status, or disability is discrimination. Calling people or policies racist in the housing arena does not work. Now, I want to be very, very clear here, and I want to thank our partners in this work for really, lifting this up. We're not talking about how you would refer to policing. We're not talking about a lot of other policy areas. We don't have the research on that, and it could be quite different. We're just talking narrowly here about the housing area, and calling people or policies racist in this area does not work. But pointing out racism and class and how they're linked, pointing out how this system is created and we can create a different system is very, very important. As we mentioned, particularly for swing voters, very important to link housing policies to economic security and people's real lived experience. And there is a whole schema of things that people are very willing to link housing to. And we are under punching when we don't make this link. People link housing very strongly to health and well-being, to stability, to jobs, to pay, to making ends meet. So there's a very strong economic analysis and a very strong health and well-being analysis that is very, very strong for us. If we look at the next slide, as I mentioned, we don't need to emphasize affordability. It's already baked in there. We can include it in the list, but we don't want to rely on it alone because it tends to shove people back into the commodity frame and individualistic leanings. One of our problems is intensity of support. We don't necessarily have people opposing us, honestly, but we want to increase more intensity. We want to increase more commitment to taking action. And the linkage to health, race, class, children, and the responsibility of government are all values frames that are powerful in the housing narrative and that increase intensity. One of the frames that the other side really has, and a value that they have that is very powerful, is personal responsibility. And what's very interesting is that because people see more of a role for government than we might have anticipated, people are very willing to talk about the responsibility of government as well as personal responsibility. One of the things that's very important here, and one of the things that's challenging, is that people see government as both part of the solution, but also part of the problem. There is not a clearly defined villain here in the housing arena. And while people in certain local fights are pretty anti-developer, they do not see developers, speculators, housing flippers as a particular enemy, and they see the enemy or the villain as quite diffuse, and they often see government as part of the villain. So we are in a little bit more challenge here than in some other areas, because we are having government, a clear role for government. That's good news, but government perceived as both part of the solution and part of the problem, which makes that role more complicated than, say, in some of our other arenas. When we couple, it's very, very strong in our value statements to couple race with discrimination. But historical racism in the housing arena is weaker. And I want to emphasize again that this is in housing. This is not necessarily in some of the new dialogues that we're having about structural racism, police, etc. Historical racism did test very strongly with African Americans, but for the rest of the population, including Latinx, historical racism was a lot more, did not test as well. And there are three reasons for that. One, people don't have a very good sense of history. And in fact, people don't know. There's an education effort to be made here. A second piece is that people are very focused. The good news is people are very focused on housing in the here and now. They don't need to get to history. They're very focused on the here and now. And thirdly, and in fact, this is a perennial problem right now for progressives. People think often we spend too much time talking about the problem and not enough time talking about the solution. And people want to start with a positive vision. Where can we head to? They do need an explanation of the problem and the mechanism for the problem. Otherwise, they'll fill it in for themselves. And in the case of housing, they often shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's just like that. It just happens like that. Rather than, no, this system was designed this way. It was created. We can design, and we have the power to create a different system. Now, when I say that people want a positive vision rather than starting with a negative, there's obviously some very, very different things going on right now in the conversation about structural racism, police brutality, etc. So again, I want to emphasize throughout that we are talking here about the area of housing, and we don't want to generalize too much to other things. The status quo message, very vulnerable. Our message is soundly defeated, and key values include economic security, safety and security, health and well-being, and fairness. And they all play an important role in a winning housing justice narrative. One caution, safe and secure are very strong words, but they can trigger individualism and conservative beliefs as well as progressive beliefs. So the best language to use is to say a safe, secure place to call home, a safe, secure place to live, to avoid this kind of priming. If we go to the next chart, we see that 79% of Americans think that housing is important. 39% say it's very important. We don't have to create awareness here. People are, we have them at hello, to quote the movie. What we need to do is increase intensity. Now, we do have intensity in some groups. Democrats, Latinx, African Americans, low-income adults, and millennials are base very intense. But for the persuadables, we are trying to develop this frame for them and increase their intensity. They're not opposed to us. They're not fighting us like in some areas, but we are being hurt by their laissez-faire attitude. The central dimension that real people volunteer is cost. It's too expensive. It's out of reach. And what's important for us is to make sure that we combine costs with something else. This is a basic human need. This is a fundamental necessity. This needs to be not only affordable, but safe and accessible. People tend more to see housing as a problem in the overall country, and then it varies a lot by locale, whether or not people see housing as a problem in their community. And they may have different explanations of the problem depending on the structure of housing in their community. People see a very, very strong connection between economic security and housing. And in fact, for the persuadables in particular, when we talk about solving the housing problem, what are the policies? The first things they volunteer are actually wage policies and economic policies. They're not housing policies. And we see this very interesting dynamic where our base starts with housing as the problem and goes to the economy. Our swings start with the economy as the problem and then go to housing. It is also, if our goal here in part is to increase intensity, it is very, very important that we are aspirational and values oriented in our messages. So don't start out with policies, don't start out with acronyms, don't start out with facts. We want to start out with values as the core narrative framing here. And that's what's actually missing from the current debate. If we turn to the next slide, people clearly see housing as a crisis. 8 in 10 see it as a crisis. And they see affordable housing as a crisis. There is a base, particularly people of color, urban people, Democrats. People tend to see a role for government, both federal and local. The persuadables see a role for both, although they tend to be more trusting and they find the local role more accessible. So what's different here than we see in a lot of areas, people are very, very willing to have a role for government. And they easily see a federal role, but they lean toward the local role as something that they trust more, is more accessible to them. And so they're not fighting us about the federal role, but they need it defined and they need it to be reassured. As we've mentioned, people are very diffuse about who to blame and what to blame for this issue. And it makes some of our narrative more complicated because there's not a ready villain. And because the very people that we want to use as an instrument for change, government, are also some of the people that people think are responsible for both the problem and solving it. If we look at the policies, which is the next slide, we have a lot of policies that test very, very well. And our problem is intensity. So 2/3 to 3/4 of the people support any number of our policies: rent controls, avoiding eviction, available spaces into housing, building more affordable housing, having the housing costs reflect the economy, tax credits and incentives to convert unused space. There are lots and lots of policies. And what's interesting here is people relate to both investment policies and regulatory policies. One of the reasons we want to move from a commodity frame to a basic human need frame is people would regulate this sector quite heavily right now. But investments come only when you move into a basic human need, fundamental necessity, home, health, well-being kind of frame. You need that bigger frame, that less individualistic frame, to get people more investment oriented. If we turn to the next slide, the key to our successful messaging is starting out with values. And the good news is we have some very, very strong values. An anchor point is that housing is a basic human need that everyone should have access to, and that housing is a public good everyone should have access to. Both of those very, very strongly supported. Now, public good, again, little less familiar term, particularly to the persuadables. They don't oppose it, but they're not exactly sure what it is. Basic human need, very accessible to everyone, very strong. And we actually move people over the course of our messaging to see this even more strongly. Our top testing message, and I still remember the group of you as advocates in Washington, D.C. that we met with, where one of you, I think from the pediatrician hospitals maybe, said, if you bring back children to us, we're going to just not trust this research because everybody just sprinkles a few children on and thinks they have a winning message. Well, I am bringing back children to you. It is a winning value, and the top testing value is all children deserve a roof over their head and a safe place to live. But people would also go way beyond housing very readily, children very readily. They love the statement, like air to breathe and food to eat, safe shelter is a basic human need. Without a job, you are likely to struggle holding down housing. Note that economic connection. Everyone should be able to choose where to live when you can afford it. Being denied where to live because of race, family status, or disability is discrimination. And just plain being denied because of race, family status, or disability is discrimination. So we have very, very strong shared values. By the way, seniors and children both tested very, very strongly. These values unite our base, the advocates, and the persuadables. And in terms of everyone should have a safe, stable place to call home, even the opposition agrees with us. Our weakest statements are statements that refer to history, decades of racist or discriminatory housing policies, that the 1% have exploited the housing market, that we are struggling to put the right policies in place. And there are two reasons for those weaker messages. First of all, again, America not too historically oriented. Number two, people don't think the wealthiest 1% have particularly exploited the housing market. This is an area where people are significantly less populist than many of the research areas that we've engaged in and many of the work we've worked with you all on in terms of the economy. And people are a little bit worried here about absolutes. They tend to not be sure that we can do this for absolutely everyone, that we won't still have some people struggling. And in general right now, across issue areas, people tend to reject absolutes. Some differences: persuadables, very children-oriented, even more so than our base. The base likes to elect new leaders as the solution. The persuadables want to pass policies, and part of that is because they're more cynical about elected officials. The base wants to embed housing in a whole neighborhood and thriving community. The persuadables tend to think more about home and a place to live. And most important, with the persuadables, we lead with jobs. With the base, we lead with the economy. So if that's the platform here, let's talk about the messaging. And people found all of our messaging pretty compelling, and all of it beat the status quo. Now, we had two major assets in terms of our messaging. One major asset was that we had the amazing linguistics analysis that Anat Shanker-Osorio did, which can be made available to you. And two, we had that very extensive list of qualitative research where we were developing the best messaging. What we found here was three messages that really generated intensity: American Dream, health and well-being, and people first. We'll show you those messages, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time summarizing them. But two of the messages, people first and health and well-being, also clearly talk about rules and politicians. Again, very, very important in this area to talk about how we got here. Otherwise, people tend to think, well, this housing thing it just like this. It just happens like this. And they're actually cynical about some of the solutions because they think, well, even if you invest, even if you give tax credits to developers or whatever, they're just going to use it to build more unaffordable housing. So very, very important that we have the mechanism here that talks about how this works. I'm not following the chat room, but I did see a very important question that I should have addressed earlier, which is, how did the housing as rights frame work? And the short answer is, it did not work very well. It works well with our base, but it did not work very well with the persuadables. Basic human need, how people live their lives, their health, their well-being, safety, security, home, all of that tested much, much stronger. So basic human need and fundamental necessity testing much stronger than housing as a right. Housing as a right was good with our base and the advocates loved it, but did not test well with the swing voters. And really, I'm really glad you put that question forward. As we look at the messages, you will see that the messages, if we look at the next slide, they are very, they're very aspirational, and they also avoid absolutes. They, and we tested messengers. If we look in the previous slide, we tested messengers as well. Now, this messenger test is not about who we recommend using. It is for us to understand that the world that we live in. And it's not honestly like we needed more reinforcement of the world in which we're living. I think the world in which we're living is very, very clear to us. But in most cases, the white male voice tested better than the female voices of color. And that is not necessarily what we want to do. Our job is not to do what is popular, but to make popular what we think is important to do. But it is affirmation of the world in which we live. And it was not just that it was more persuasive, but the white male voice also coming forward as more authoritative to voters. Again, we're not recommending white male voices, and we're not even saying this would extend to other areas. For example, when we did work with Center for Community Change on poverty, actually women's voices and women of color were the stronger voice. But we're just saying that this is the world in which we live in, and it applies to this sector. So let's look at our best testing messages. And what we're going to do is you're going to see the moment-to-moment dials. So think about how you would be dialing. And you're going to see our base, opposition, persuadables. You're also going to see yourselves. You're going to see the advocate line and the total lines. So this is the American Dream message. Watch what people dial up on. And this is on a scale from 0 to 100.
Imagine an America where all of us can live in vibrant, thriving communities with access to health care, quality schools, and the freedom to make our own best lives for ourselves and our families. Housing is the foundation on which our lives are built and to which our dreams are anchored. By ensuring all of us have an affordable place to call home, we can enable our neighborhoods to thrive. We have achieved the American dream when every child, every elder, and every person with a disability has a home in America. By making housing affordable, we can make the American promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness apply to all of us. No exceptions.
So you can see here the advocates liking the message, and you can see the language that tested well. You can see a couple of things. One, we're seeing a very fast jump in terms of engaging people. People really like vibrant, thriving communities. They see housing and the whole constellation of healthcare, schools, very tied to that. So we are talking about a big constellation here. We are able to use the freedom frame, which is very exciting because freedom is the #1 value out there in America. It is also the #1 word that the right uses more than the left does. So it's very powerful that we are able to co-opt their 2 key values, freedom and responsibility, talking about the freedom to make our own best lives for ourselves and our families, and talking about government responsibility as well as personal responsibility. Notice housing is the foundation on which our lives are built. Again, we're connecting housing to other fundamental things. Just saying it's a right rings empty to people. It rings like, frankly, progressive rhetoric to people. Linking housing to what it means for people and how it's a basic necessity, how it's a foundation, tested repeatedly very, very strongly for people. We don't alienate the opposition, but we do have limited appeal to them. And again, given their attitudes, this is something that we're eager to do and glad to see them. The next slide is the spokespeople. I'm going to skip this slide just because we've talked about this already. and go to the origin or the structure of the narrative, it is important to know that the white male speaker tests better for all groups of color as well. And it does speak again to the structural racism in our society and the heritage of white privilege. But except for Native Americans did respond stronger to women's voices, actually. They were the one group that did that. But what is the structure of the narrative here? First, we start with future-oriented languaging. Bringing in core values of healthcare, education, freedom is a very strong start here. And people see this as positive, future-oriented. This narrative is a little weaker because we don't explicitly name a villain or a problem. And we double down on aspirational goals, which tested off the charts. You saw people dial up on this language. In the end, we want to combine these messages with an analysis of, a limited analysis of the villain and the problem. Then we connected to positive outcomes, and people really want to know, what are they going to get here? And they love the language, every child, every elder, every person with a disability has a home in America. And then just as we began with a shared value, the most powerful narratives end with a shared value. By making housing affordable, we can make the American promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness apply to all of us, no exceptions. You did see a little bit of toggling on the no exceptions. That language is tested very well in other settings, a little bit more complicated here. People a little bit jittery, can we really do it for everyone? But people like setting the goal of doing it for all of us. The second best testing message, and the one that actually predicted the most to shifting people's attitudes in our direction, is the message called health and well-being. We're going to show you the version narrated by the African-American woman. And let's watch it, see how you would dial, and then let's talk about the structure of that narrative.
No matter where we're from or where we live, having a safe, stable place to come home to is the foundation for our well-being and mental health. It's where we celebrate our good times and recover from the rest. But today, because of unfair rules, too many of us are left merely surviving in unhealthy environments or under the threat that one unforeseen problem will have us out on the street. For people to be and stay well, both physically and mentally, for children to grow and elders to flourish, we need to ensure that everyone has housing they can count on. We need to ensure everyone in America has a safe, accessible, healthy, and truly affordable home. When residents thrive, communities thrive.
So let's look at the language here and look at what some of the work. Now, this was a little bit slower start, and we like people to really get their attention really fast, but people agreed with us. No matter where we're from or where we live, having a safe, stable place to come home to is a foundation for our well-being. But it wasn't until we started with home and foundation that people really started to take off. They liked the language, but they just weren't sure where we were headed. Notice the language because of unfair rules. So here we do have a villain and we have a mechanism. And you'll notice that the opposition, the red line, really dialing down on that. They, remember, are people who think this is all due to you personally. There's no role for government here, and you're on your own, and that's the better way to be. So they don't like it when we talk about the way in which this system is created and designed. It didn't just happen like this. Everybody else responding positively. Notice that people respond very strongly to the call to action, and it's values-oriented. We need to ensure everyone has housing they can count on. We need to ensure everyone in America has a safe, accessible, healthy, and truly affordable home. People also like the language around children to grow up in and elders to flourish in. So very, very strong message. And again, what's exciting about these narratives is that they are developing strong messages in the housing area, but they are linking to other narratives that we want to be making simultaneously. So our goal was only to develop a housing narrative, but I think one of the most exciting findings is the fact that we can link this to the economy, we can link this to well-being and mental health, which is ultimately where all of us want to go. We have a slide here on the messengers. You can see again the white male messenger testing slightly better, and including with the persuadable and the base, unfortunately. So we have work to do everywhere. Also, the white male alienating the opposition more, because the opposition, which doesn't like this message, more alienated when a white man is saying it, interestingly enough. But let's look at why this message works and the arc of this narrative. Again, we begin with a core value. We are also starting from the get-go with a community orientation. We were very worried about this. We were worried that we might not be able to do that. And people were, even though they see a home as someplace that an individual family or an individual will live in, they start out with a pretty community-based orientation, way more than we would have thought. And we position housing as an important part of a person's life and well-being and the foundation, which again, all of that helps us to move out of the commodity frame into a more public frame. This message does a very good job in people's minds of describing the mechanism and the adverse effects. And that's very powerful to people. It's one of the reasons why we move people so much. We're not leaving them on their own to try to figure out what's going on here. And in fact, they've already told us they have a hard time figuring out what's going on. We're applying the mechanism. We acknowledge what we want to achieve, and we're putting some very powerful reference of children and elders here. And then we end with values and aspirational goals. By the way, this thriving communities and this language of thriving tests very, very strongly. It tests strongly here and strongly in the economic arena. And then our last of our top testing messages, putting people first. We'll move to that slide and
Most
play.
of us want to provide for our families, have a safe place to call home, and pursue our dreams regardless of what we look like or where we come from. But today, politicians set housing regulations and policies that make it harder for people struggling to make ends meet to find and afford a safe place of their own. We need our leaders to put people first. By joining together, we can change policies to benefit all of us, like building more affordable options or regulating rent increases to limit how much someone can increase our rent. Together, we can ensure everyone, regardless of zip code, has a place to live our lives and care for our families.
And you can see here the very strong language of a safe place to call home, regardless of what we look like, establishing the inclusiveness. We have a mechanism here, politicians setting housing regulations and policies. We need to put our leaders first. So we've linked policies and new leadership, and we end on a values-oriented frame, regardless of zip code, has to have a place to live our lives. So very, very strong message, applying all of the rules that we've talked about. We're running over, so I'm going to skip the messenger piece and just go quickly to the structure of the message. And you can see here it outlined values, most of us, not absolutist language, going beyond just naming the politicians as the villains, but highlighting the bad actions that they take, defining the goals and what we can do to change things, and starting and ending on powerful values and inclusive language that seems very non-divisive to people. We were going to, yeah.
So Linda, maybe we can do the top 5 do's and don'ts and then open to question and answer, because I realize we're running over.
Yeah, in fact,
can
sure,
focus
we can do
on-
that. Skip ahead to that. And
Sorry.
you can all get all of this. So, housing crisis, people are there that we have them at hello. We don't want to refer to just an affordable housing crisis. People think of the crisis as in terms of security, stability, well-being. We don't want to, we're reducing our frame and commodity, making it individualistic commodity when we say affordable. Basic human need and fundamental necessity. That tests better than public good or common good, which about half the people not exactly sure what that is, and it tests better than right. Deserve versus guarantee. Now, this is not always true, and there are many things in the housing arena that are different than in some of the other arenas. So again, we've emphasized here that these findings are meant to apply to the housing arena, but deserve sounds better to people than guarantee. And it's interesting that people want government involvement, but they also think that there is a little element of choice here, and they are more nervous about absolutes when it comes to housing. People strongly believe in discrimination. They do not respond strongly to the historical racism argument, but they do respond very strongly right now to inclusion and discrimination. They think there is current discrimination in housing and they want to deal with that. And then very strong to highlight how everyone should have access regardless of the money they have. Linking class and race, linking economics and housing, very, very powerful with people. So lots more to talk about when we go to questions, but let me stop there and turn it back to the folks at CCC. Thank you.
Wonderful. So Linda, thank you so much. And I know that for folks, this is a lot to digest. There's a lot here. And so I want to reiterate something we said on the chat, which is that all of this will be available to you. Excuse me, both the report and this recording will be available on our sites and on the microsite. So I want to just make sure that folks know this is not a one and done and this is the only thing. So Linda, I wanted to open up to questions because there are a lot of questions. And many of the questions, understandably so, really revolve around race and how to talk about race and racist housing policies in our nation's history, such as redlining, for example. And so we had so many questions on that. So Linda, can you talk a little bit more about why using racist doesn't work in housing narrative and in housing policies? Can you talk a little bit more about how we can use some of this, particularly around naming a racist policy in this current context or not, right? Like a lot of the questions really were revolving around the moment that we are in, and then the reconciling what the research has found around some of this. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
So it's very, very complicated, and you said it already, Marisol, but I want to underscore it, that what we're talking about here is only the housing area. I would imagine, and I would love to be engaged in the research on it, it could be very, very different in the policing and criminal justice realm and some of the realms in which we are all very, very engaged in today. This is just about housing. Racist doesn't work for a couple of reasons, or let me say how we can talk about it. Yes, and I see Ivory Taylor's comment that they can't be disconnected. I completely agree with you that they can't be disconnected. But I want to make sure very often, and it's not my intent in saying that clarification is not to say they shouldn't be connected. They should be connected. My point is I don't want to extrapolate from this research beyond this research. I don't want to extrapolate into other arenas. So thank you for that clarification. That was a very important one. In terms of racism and racist, first of all, we do explicitly mention race. We should explicitly mention race. We're going to do it whether it tested well or not, and it actually tends to work well. And that is whether we talk about people based on their race, whether we talk about black, brown, or white, whether we talk about discrimination. These are all very, very strong ways to talk about it. Racist to people sounds like divisive. It sounds like a political label. It also is often linked to historical racism, and except for African Americans, and that is a very important point, people want to deal with the here and now. They want to start fixing things. They want to start with a positive. Notice aspirational messaging, particularly testing well, because home and housing is so tied to people's aspirations and their dreams for themselves and their families. So people don't want, Americans in general often are not that historically operational, and they particularly aren't historical here. Many people who are suffering housing challenges or housing dilemmas are actually in relatively fast-growing new communities. So they also don't tend to think, like when we did the focus groups in Orlando, for example, people were like, well, I don't know about any history of segregation. These houses just got built last year. So some of this just is different than their experience, different than their orientation. People want to be aspirational. They want to link it to American. They want it to be for all people, and they want it to be in the here and now rather than in the past, which is often a cultural phenomena for us.
So Linda, as you are talking about this, can you talk a little bit about one of the questions that we had from Art Stoltzfus was, how do we address past harms due to racist housing policies, right? Which is sort of at the root too of a lot of the questions. If the idea of talking historically about race and housing doesn't resonate, then how do we address those past harms?
I guess I would have to understand more. I think it depends on the context, honestly, and what you want to accomplish. So it's a really good question, and it's a really complicated one. I mean, obviously there is an education component here. And again, our goal is not to just say what is popular, but to make popular what needs to be said. That said, we didn't dial it, but in the history of racism frame, the single the language that people dialed down on the most was our nation's history of racial discrimination. And what we have here is a situation where people really want to fix the problem now and not particularly they want to know the mechanisms. They want to change the rules, but they're not particularly interested in what the practices were in the past. They want to change the practices for the future. Now, there's a lot in terms of developing a consciousness and changing practices where we're rightly concerned about how we mix this messaging together. But it's also true that to get people on board for the kind of changes that we want, they don't have to have a historical analysis. It may be that all of America would be better if we understood this historical analysis, and that may be a separate goal. But if our goal specifically is to, say, pass that set of policies, which was quite popular to people, but low intensity, then it turns out just talking about, let's get this done now. This is a fundamental necessity for everyone. This is a basic human need. This is the center of our American dreams for all of our families. Then it is better to be in the current. People are with us on moving now, and so we don't need the historical analysis. And in fact, people tend to push back against it. They just want to be aspirational and act for the now. In the broader things that we are engaged in, taking on racism in our society, taking on structural racism, that's a different issue for sure. But in terms of, so it really depends on, when you say taking on the racism in our housing policy, it depends honestly on what we are trying to do where.
Okay. Thank you, Celinda. Is there anything else that you can add to, there are so many questions about how the pandemic and COVID and the movement for Black Lives may have shifted how open people are to messages around historical racism. And if there's anything else around that and how that might relate to historical racism in housing that you can add as either guidance or any other comments specifically around that, because I think that that is a point where folks are wrestling with the findings and the current moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, really, really good question. So let me separate the question though, because I think it's two slightly different answers to it. So and of course, we're in this era of kind of serial crises, or that's the way the public is processing it, except, you know, frankly, for African-American voters and some millennials who are processing it as much more of a continuum. But for older voters, Latinx, white voters, Asian American Pacific Islanders, they're treating it as more serial. So in the initial stage of COVID, we did not see people particularly increasing their notion of historical racism, either generally or specifically. Now, we were doing the housing research specifically in early April, and things may have evolved as people became more aware of disparate impact, et cetera. But at least initially, COVID did not particularly increase notions about historical racism. It did increase notions about health and well-being and disparities in health and well-being quite dramatically. And that was independent of this research. We know that from other research. The analysis and the conversation that's going on right now could be changing things quite dramatically. And just as I said, and several people have said how connected this is, and then people are also saying, just as we said, the housing cannot be extrapolated. I think, let's say we continue through the summer and on, if we were to repeat some of this research in September, October, we might find that people have moved on some of these issues. So I can only speak for the time in which this research was done. And that was before a lot of the dialogue about structural racism and linking that structural racism, developing that consciousness about racism and structural racism. And we're seeing voters move pretty dramatically in the polls, particularly Latinx and white voters, and particularly white women. So, you know, if we were to repeat some of this stuff in September, October, we might see some real changes. I don't know.
Thank you, Celinda. And I won't be able to get to everyone's questions. Obviously, we have a lot of folks and a lot of questions, so I'm just grouping some of these into some really key places. And I know on the issue of race and the questions that are coming up here, this could be a whole separate conversation and frankly webinar as well. It should be, but I'm going to switch gears now to talk a little bit about some of the, or ask a little bit about some of the questions around the messaging specifically. So Celinda, we had a series of questions around the idea of deserve versus needs, right? And so several folks raising questions and concerns about using the word deserve, and it's triggering the argument about who is and who isn't deserving. Can you talk a little bit about how we manage that in terms of that language and continuing sort of that narrative of the deserving people or not deserving people? And that's all obviously in quotes.
Oh boy, that's a super, super good question. So frankly, in a lot of other areas, like in the economics area, well, in the healthcare area, let me start there. Deserve versus guarantee, the recommendation was actually the opposite for a lot of the reasons you discussed. Most of the time, and I'm so glad you asked this question, I should have volunteered it. Most of the time we recommend guarantee, not deserve. There are two things that I would say here that are slightly different. For whatever reason, and it may be the power of the homelessness debate, I'm not sure exactly. It's something that we need to figure out, because it's a little bit different here than we've seen in a lot of other research. People were pushing back more on absolutes, and more so than we've seen in some of the other research. like the economic research or the healthcare research. So that's something I think in the next round of research, and I'm saying that theoretically, we needs to be bared down on more, because we don't completely understand that. It's a little different than we had anticipated. It's a little different than we had seen. We gave one example here. It was true in several places. Interestingly, deserve and basic human need were highly correlated. Now, normally, that's not true. And in fact, that's why we worry about it, because basic human need, everybody gets, right? Deserve, well, then we're into evaluating. For some reason here, people were not evaluating who is deserving or not. They thought everyone, every child, every elder, every disabled, everyone, and everyone tested very well. It was more that they heard guarantee as an absolute and deserve as less absolute. So we didn't find the negative around deserve that we normally find and are very cautious of. We found that people were more sensitive here to guarantee than in some other areas. Usually guarantee tests better. We did not find here that people then broke it down to who's deserving and who's not. They saw it as, if you will, a less absolute guarantee, and it was highly correlated with need. So here we're recommending use deserve in contrast to guarantee. We lifted it up because it was so different than what we had found in other areas. We need to explore it more, but it did not seem to have the backlash and the unintended consequences that we have seen in other work, and that people are rightly very cautious about.
What about, Celinda? We have a couple of questions too about the villains and naming villains here. So one question was, since government is seen as part of the problem but not a direct villain, should we be tying local policy as a direct support or detriment to the housing solution? So that's one example of the question, but there were some questions around really sort of naming a villain when you're not really sure where the villain is on the role of that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's really, really, really an astute question, and it was a real dilemma. So here's what we know. We need to provide the mechanism, whether we provide the villain or not, because otherwise people will invent it, and they tend to say, oh, well, it just happens. It's like the tides. It just happens. And it's very disempowering if we don't provide the mechanism. So politicians deciding certain policies, politicians being influenced by political contributions, politicians writing, setting rules, electing new leaders, all of that was very, very important, because unlike other areas, like in the economy, people could invent the mechanism for themselves. Here they could not. They were really unsure about how did we get here and how could we get out. And it was empowering to provide the mechanisms, because one of our dilemmas was actually cynicism. Not that people opposed us, but they were wondering, could we really get this done? How would we get it done? How could we possibly influence it? And then the second thing we found is that leaders, electing new leaders, very powerful with the base. That's the mechanism they saw. And our swing saw the mechanism of policies. So interestingly, in part because they're so cynical about all politicians. So we need the mechanism for sure. We need how this system gets designed. It didn't just happen. How the rules got created. Then when it comes to villain, it's a little trickier, because the populist villains, people didn't blame the 1%. They didn't blame the speculators particularly. They thought, yeah, they have a role in there, but not that much. The housing flippers, the developers, more on the local level, but you know, really developers responsible for this nationwide? I don't think so. And so it was important to talk about the role that certain politicians and leaders played for us to get for us to have this be comprehensible to people.
That's great, Celinda. Thank you. We actually have 4 minutes left, and we could be here. There were so many amazing, really strong questions here. And I want to end with someone here said, on the chat, I have the sense that we're in a very formative moment where messages can really shape people's values / frameworks rather than just tacitly responding to them. And I just thought that that was a powerful statement because it's exactly, I think that so many of us are very much in that frame of mind, and research like this can help point us to how, what are the narratives, again, specifically around housing in this case, that we can incorporate, adapt, shift, move, change with all of the points that Celinda raised. Celinda, is there anything final that you would like to add, any clarifications or points of emphasis that you would like to add before we close out?
3 things. 1, I'd like to thank everyone on this call for their convictions, their leadership. I'd love to thank the team, both internally at Lake Research Partners and Jesse for the leadership and the team, and all of you all as partners in this work. I think that this is an area that really didn't have a narrative, and this is a massive intervention, but there is still a lot of work to be done and shaped, and we're in a very fast changing environment. And I too found that person's comments were very, very powerful and completely agree with it. So Marisol, thank you for ending on that note, because I completely agree with the person who wrote that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Celinda. And so I'll close out by, this was already in our chat, but our next webinar is going to be June 24th, which is around narrative strategy and aligning our narratives, raising many of the points that and questions that were raised here. July 8th, we are going to be digging deep into race in our 3rd webinar and how this applies to, again, another extension of digging into how we can incorporate the findings and learnings here for the current moment. The 29th will be cultural strategy, where we'll talk about the impact of narrative through art and culture, the impact of this narrative on art and culture. And then our last webinar of the series will be on August 19th, which will be around driving this narrative in legislative proposals and policy fights, with which many of you are engaged in. And so I just want to say thank you again from Community Change, Race Forward, and Policy Link, and to Celinda and Jesse and the team at Lake Research Partners for all of this amazing work. We will be sharing all of this out with all of you, and thank you again, and we hope to see you in a few weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.